Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Keyur, and I welcome all of you for today's exciting webinar on a hacker's perspective to ransomware attacks. Firstly, some housekeeping rules. This webinar is being recorded, and we will be taking up questions towards the end of the webinar. So if you have any questions anytime during the session, please feel free to drop them in the chat window, and we will take them towards the end. With this, let me introduce the speaker for today's webinar, Mr. Chia Wykett, who is a Security Product Manager, Management Director for Security Services at Lumen APAC. With this, let me hand it over to Wykett. Wykett, thank you.
Thank you. Hi, good morning and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. The significant event of 2020 wasn't just about COVID-19 pandemic. In fact, last year, in terms of the volume of cybersecurity incidents, especially ransomware attacks, were unprecedented. Whatever that figure is, we all know that ransomware menace has only gotten bigger. Businesses, large or small, are impacted. Let's take a look this morning to understand why ransomware attacks are growing. Well, first, hackers or ransomware attackers are a lot more organized and motivated today. They are extremely resourceful. A lot of them work in groups, in organizations that are aimed at using a variety of techniques, including social engineering, psychological warfare, to be very targeted on their victims. And the profile of such hackers today carrying out ransomware attacks are very different. They are no longer just people who are in it for fun. They are no longer thrill seekers. They are much more objective based, and the objective is very much to monetize the scheme, right? So what used to be mass distributed threat is now very focused on enterprises. It's no longer targeted on consumers or the retail. Why? Because there are a lot more reward or money to make from businesses or enterprise. A lot of these victims are being researched to understand their propensity to pay, and hackers will find out what are their attack surface, what are their vulnerabilities, in order to carry out their targeted attack on enterprises or business, right? So they also deploy social psycho-engineering tactics just to pressurize, influence their victims into paying. After all, they're doing this for the money, right? So what has actually contributed to this rise in ransomware? First of all, is very lucrative. According to a survey of about 5,000 companies, the average cost of a ransomware payout was about $1.5 million when in cases where it was paid out. And even when ransom was not paid, it's costs about 700 over K in terms of recovery and the cost of getting back in the business back into operations. And as the threat actors behind ransomware attacks have matured in their capabilities, they have refined their approach to generating revenue from this successful business model. But what actually made it easier and for these attackers to get paid was the inception of Bitcoin or cryptocurrencies. So it's easier now to receive ransom payments without any money trail or traceability. The other thing that has happened is big game hunting. So cyber criminals actors aim at high value targets, such as those industries that depend on information technology to run their business, whether it's a managed services provider, a media company, or healthcare, or even government agencies, right? So by delivering and activating ransomware on many different systems within that corporate network, at the same time, attackers can maximize the damage they inflict. This often results in situations where the organizations may be more likely to pay a ransom demand, where compared to a scenario where a single endpoint has been affected. Right? So a lot of this big game hunting, we see a lot more coordinated and strategic ransomware attacks towards high net worth targets. So one key factor that made it so easy for ransomware attackers is the rise of what we know as ransomware as a service, or RAS. Right? So this is where ransomware developers sell or lease their tools to those who use them to then perform an attack. It makes it so easy, and the tools available to even non-technical person. According to SingCert, many of the observed local ransomware incidents in 2020 were RAS variants, right? So it's becoming apparently responsible for many attacks, especially large enterprises. One of the more prominent one was a large online foreign exchange service company on the New Year's Eve of 2020, left them almost offline for a month, caused huge disruption to not just to their business, but also to the FSIs that depend on that online foreign exchange company. Apparently, they paid about $2+ million just to regain access to their systems. So how does RAS works? First of all, the ransomware developer creates some custom exploit code that is then either rented out or licensed to an affiliate or the party who's going to exercise or carry out that attack. In return, what they are asking for is either a fee or a percentage share in the proceeds from the attack. The affiliate then set up a malicious hosting site with a custom exploit code and then identify their target and find a way to deliver the exploit code to that victim, that target, whether it's through a malicious email or a link. When the victim clicks on that link or goes to that website, the ransomware gets downloaded, executed on that endpoint, encrypts the victim's files, identify additional target on their network, and then go and does its job. So at the end of it, there will be a ransom note and instruction on how to pay that ransom, of course, with untraceable funds. So if that ransom is paid off, a money launderer comes into play to move that money into multiple transformations, obscure the identities of both the affiliate as well as the developer. The developer takes a share of the proceeds, and after the affiliate gets paid, they send a decryptor or key to the victim. Now, very often you will find victims after paying may not necessarily be given a decryption key. So sometimes they might still end up with encrypted files and the damage even after paying. So this RAS model actually helps simplify and make it a lot more rampant with ransomware attacks. Right? So what are the three top attack vectors? How does ransomware get delivered to its target and victim? First of all, phishing is still the most common initial infection vector. Ransomware such as Shade or Real commonly uses this vector. It's a traditional old method, but yet very effective. Why? Because employees are human. Human beings are unpredictable. Sometimes we are vulnerable to clicking on malicious links or attachments, regardless of how many times you conduct awareness training. The second vector is remote access. It's becoming rampant, and according to Trend Micro's report, stolen or brute force RDP credentials continue to get sold on the dark web. Right? You can buy it for a few dollars sometimes. And there's also an increasing or alarming trend. A number of what we call access as a service offerings, where an attacker breach a victim and potentially doing recon, installing hidden backdoors in the environment, and then selling this access to others to carry out their ransomware attack. The third one is drive-by attack. This involves criminals taking control of legitimate websites, redirecting users to sites that host malicious code designed to exploit known vulnerabilities in their browser. And this exploit codes most frequently used by drive-by attacks were raid, fallout, and others. And that's how they delivered that payload to their target. Now, of course, these top three attack vectors are not the only ones. There are others, such as vulnerabilities, especially zero-day. Most common being the last couple of months, you have probably seen Microsoft Exchange vulnerabilities being exploited, and ransomware delivered as part of that campaign to targeted victims. Right? But it's very important not just to understand how ransomware attackers get in. It's also very important to understand how they avoid being detected. So typically, it's not that difficult to get in, but it's a lot more harder to avoid detection. They have to remain promiscuous and obscure their presence. How do they do that? First of all, they have to find a way to disable anti-malware software. So identifying what are these anti-malware that's running, their processes, stopping them or causing them to run inappropriately. And then they have to inject code. Why? Because first of all, you need higher access or privileged access to system resources. And you could probably borrow some of the operating systems processes to leverage on their privilege and access, such as injecting code into WinLogon, injecting code into your browser like Internet Explorer, and running those with malicious code. Right? And then in order to hide itself and avoid detection, many of this ransomware will try to spin off and spawn child processes or ancestor processes. So in the course of doing that, they would have to delete the binary image of those ancestor processes to minimize the artifacts, reduce the footprint on the compromised system. And then as they spawn these new processes, the parent or the predecessor process will self-terminate or being terminated by the child process. This will avoid any suspicions in terms of if there are detection software running. Right? So these are some of the techniques that or tactics that ransomware attackers use to avoid detection. And a lot of you might be thinking, is antivirus good enough? Well, it depends, because antivirus runs on the basis of signatures, sort of like DNA. You got COVID-19 because you inspect the RNA and DNA of what's collected as sample. The problem with that is if and only if newer variants of ransomware have signatures available. Because if they don't, there's no way your next-gen antivirus is going to be able to catch it or detect it. And there are tens of thousands of ransomware variants out there. What you see on the right here are just the main family groups, right? So as ransomware becomes polymorphic, in-memory, fileless, it's getting harder and harder to detect them. The traditional antivirus or even endpoint protection platform is not going to be able to do its job. So how do you actually counter that? And especially when ransomware is evolving even more sophisticated. So as per SANS Institute in 2020, more than 1,000 companies had their data leaked after not agreeing to pay out ransom. For example, major US university, while they were able to recover their data from backups and get their systems running, they still had to pay ransom to stop the hackers from leaking student data into public domain. A lot of it is because the tactics used by ransomware attackers have changed. They're now adopting hybrid or double extortion attacks. This emerging attack method suggests and reinforce that traditional defenses are no longer sufficient. They will not just encrypt your systems, they will steal and exfiltrate data out so that they hold you at ransom to decrypt your systems and to prevent them from leaking out your data into the public. And there are now increasingly cases where they would traverse your system to find ways to disable your backup so that you become incapable of restoring or recovering from backups. So it's actually something that is becoming very difficult to defend against unless you have ability to detect and stop these attacks in the first place, right? So what are the three key takeaways that I want to leave you with? First of all, the manual security response mechanisms are not adequate to cope with the vast volume of ransomware variants. There are so many vulnerabilities across different IT systems and infrastructure. It just isn't possible anymore to do this manually. You need sophisticated and tools to be able to detect attacks in milliseconds, near real time, and be able to catch them and respond to these attacks in real time, right? Many of these mechanisms rely on detection of malware and ransomware signatures, as you saw in the next-gen antivirus software, but it's also necessary to have the intelligence to detect based on the behavior of what's executing on your endpoints. Secondly, a lot of organizations and IT teams invest in expensive tools and setup, but many a times it needs to be calibrated. It needs to be configured. You need to have protection policies. You need to have a continuation of calibration and fine-tuning to tackle new threat vectors, new attack methods. And in addition, having a round-the-clock ability to respond immediately makes a big difference. So a holistic approach is needed rather than just looking at one part of a problem. The third one is you are as strong as your weakest link. No amount of tools, systems, automation is going to prevent a sophisticated attack that combines social engineering, psychological warfare tactics, malvertisement, baits. If your users are engaging these tactics, are not aware of the dangers. Security begins with effective and continual training and awareness of all your employees. Not because this is part of a compliance and audit requirement, but your organizational survival depends on it. It's becoming increasingly true that it's not a question of if you're going to be attacked. It's a matter of when. With tens of thousands of variants out there, it's just too much. We're fighting against an overwhelming threat, right? So what can Lumen do for you? As an organization, if you need help in solving not just one particular part of problem, we can actually help you to assess where are the gaps in your controls, where are the vulnerabilities. We can scan for those vulnerabilities, carry out penetration testing, make sure you understand the gaps and weaknesses you have, and address them. At the same time, there's comprehensive ransomware protection suite in the terms of both detecting for suspicious user activities, lateral movements, recon activities, so that we can mitigate this kind of advanced persistent threats, as well as to be able to detect ransomware at endpoints and be able to respond immediately with protection policy. So these are some of the ways that we can actually help our clients today. So to wrap up, finally, as gratitude for you spending time this morning with us, we are providing a complimentary access to a security maturity assessment tool from IDC. This tool leverages IDC's vast subject matter experience and knowledge to understand your security posture and provide you with some insights, as well as guidance on business steps you can take to improve your security posture. This so that you can address cybersecurity challenges today's connected world. It just takes a couple of minutes to participate in this survey, and you receive a customized security assessment and guidance from IDC. Scan the QR code and fill out the form, and we can share the access code with you. Okay. So hurry up, this offer is only for the week, right? And lastly, I just want to share with you the vision of Lumen's connected security is to see more, stop more, not just about detecting threats, but to understand where the vulnerabilities, the gaps are in your controls, and able to help you safeguard or put in the necessary measures to mitigate and prevent cyber risks from impacting your business. With that, I can open up for Q&A.
Thank you, Vaikit. We have now come to the Q&A part of this webinar. There are several questions that have already been raised by the respondents, so I will read them out. And in the meanwhile, if you have any questions for Vaikit or Lumen team in general, please feel free to submit them in the Q&A window, and I will take them up in the order of their submission. So Vaikit, we have one of the first questions here from one of the attendees. The question is, we have traditionally relied on log monitoring and correlation to detect for security incidents. Are you suggesting this is no longer adequate? If yes, how so?
Okay. So traditional log correlation or monitoring leverages on use cases, right? Correlation rules. So basically you ingest, you collect logs, and you determine what you are looking out for. You're looking out for authentication failures, you're looking out for malicious traffic to perhaps C2 hosts, but we know what we are looking for. The problem with that is this sort of security controls addresses known risks, right? With evolving ransomware, for example, having an attack vector that leverages on compromised networks, being able to infiltrate into your network and in a very promiscuous way, we need to look for activities that apparently are suspicious, that looks malicious. So instead of identifying what bad is, we now identify what good looks like so that we can pick up what bad means. What are the malicious activities that's happening? So for example, leveraging user and entity behavior analytics, we could actually profile and baseline user activities. And there is an action or an activity that happens outside of that baseline, we raise that up as a risk, we flag it up for the SOC to action on it and investigate and respond to that event. So say, for example, if you have compromised credentials, that user might be working 9 to 5, Monday to Fridays, and then that same credential might be used to log in successfully on a Sunday morning, 3 a.m. We'll be able to pick that up. But a log correlation, it might not meet that use case criteria, right? So it won't trigger. So that's why there's no silver bullet in security. Most often than not, you need a combination of multiple controls to identify, prevent, mitigate cyber risk. I hope that answers the question.
Thanks, Vaikit. We have one more question. Is EDR alone sufficient to mitigate ransomware attacks and prevent it from spreading beyond an endpoint to my corporate network?
Actually, EDR is an important control and tool to have. First of all, because it covers one of the weakest link, the human nature, employees clicking on malicious links or downloading malicious payload through attachments. But however, there are multiple attack vectors with ransomware. And I think if you look at it, there are cases where vulnerabilities have been exploited, whether at VPN gateways, whether with Microsoft Exchange or through supply chain attacks, or compromised credentials on your network or exposed RDP, that a lot of times it may bypass your EDR. You may not see that impact on your endpoints, but the bad actors have infiltrated into your network. So I think it requires, in order to be safe, it requires a multiple sets of controls to be in place, monitoring your network, monitoring for user entity behavior, and monitoring for malicious traffic, for lateral movements. All these are important parts of measures that needs to be in place. But EDR is one of those.
Okay. Thanks, Vaikit. We have another question. It's a two-part question. Hi, Vaikit. Could I check, especially for air-gap environments, that is non-external facing / internet accessible environments, what are the measures that Lumen can suggest to reduce attack surface and increase cybersecurity posture? That's one. And at the same time, remote monitoring is not possible since we do not allow external connectivity. How can we procure or subscribe external security monitoring service?
Okay, so let me try to address that. The first one. So, ever heard of the story of Stuxnet? Right? It's air gap. And in fact, there are many stories around nuclear facilities and OT environments, oil and gas refineries that are air gap, but increasingly they are still vulnerable, because while you can have an air gap, there might be carriers of malicious software or malware that could get into that environment. It's just like COVID-19. You can have a lockdown, but it's still possible to have infection rates going up. Right? It's never 100%. So how do you protect such environment? I think it's still necessary to have adequate monitoring, detection, and response capabilities within that air-gap environment. So, take for example, a EDR. I don't think it's something that you only need to subscribe to and have that deployed in a corporate world. I think you can still have that deployed within an air gap and contained environment, just to safeguard in case somebody plugs in or transfers in a malicious file or payload. Secondly, there are other controls, physical access, physical security, disabling of devices, whether it's USB ports, etc. All these are necessary to prevent that air-gap environment from being compromised. Right? And I think help me remind me again for the second part of the question again. Sorry.
It's that at the same time, remote monitoring is not possible. It's not an option since they do not allow external connectivity. How can we procure or subscribe external security monitoring service?
You probably have to resort to on-prem deployment of tools. I think that's going to be a little bit challenging to procure or outsource and a third-party cloud service for monitoring and detection and response. Many of the technologies that's available today, whether that's SIEM or whether that's a EDR or any other security technologies, they do have available on-prem deployment options. The only caveat is then you would have to have the necessary resources and team skilled, trained, to be able to support and maintain it, manage it, and probably have to think about how do you have the resources or capabilities to respond to detected alerts and events any time of the day, round the clock. So you might have to set up a SOC in order to do that. But increasingly, I've seen that even in the old days where you have OT environment in industrial control systems that used to be air gap are being integrated into IT networks, and you have dashboards, you have mobile apps that could actually control a lot of these instruments. So there are OT systems that's available out there that monitors for threat in those environments and then sends those alerts out to SIEM so that we can then respond and to that. But those are no longer pure air gap environment. Okay.
Thanks, Vaikit. There are still several questions, but unfortunately, I think we are running out of time. We will ensure that Vaikit and our experts respond to these questions offline via email using the contact details that you have. In case there are more questions, please feel free to drop them to us and we will reply back. What we will also encourage is we are pasting a link for the feedback on the chat window, and you can also scan it using the QR code on your mobile. We will really appreciate and love to hear your feedback on how was the experience on this webinar. Please do provide us feedback and also suggestions on what topics, interesting topics would you like us to take on for the next webinar. Thank you so much. We will keep this URL up on the screen for a few more minutes, half a minute or a minute, so you can take that and answer the questions. You can find the URL also in the chat window if you would like to just click from there. Okay, with that, I thank you for your time, and thank you, Vaikit, for joining us for this webinar and taking all of us through this interesting topic. Have a good day, everyone. Thank you so much.
Have a good day.